scathing detail some of the issues behind Jamal Khashoggi's violent, brutal murder, really unprecedented murder in a third country by the highest levels of Saudi officialdom. And these people in Saudi Arabia depend on a variety of platforms to get information. And I think that's why it's concerning to see Netflix comply with this request. Because actually, we know that tech companies across the world, US-based tech companies, are complying with these requests to take down specific pieces of content that are newsworthy, that are important, at the direct request of governments. And so this is an expansion now to another platform in a way that we're seeing around the world.
Hassan Minhaj also took on Saudi Arabia targeting women drivers on his censored episode of Patriot Act.
Prisons are filling up in Saudi Arabia. Hundreds are being detained, including critics of MBS and political activists. Some of the most prominent activists are women who protested the driving ban. And MBS had them arrested, and several of them are still in prison today. Even executions are up. The country is on track to execute more than 2,000 people by the year 2030.
Legalizing women drivers and then jailing the women who were the activists for women driving.
Well, I think it's a twofold reflection of how Mohammed bin Salman is. First of all, I think the lifting of the ban on women driving was a very smart move because it reflects a recognition that the vast majority of the Saudi population never supported and don't support the ban on women driving. Over 50% of the population is under the age of 25. Over 75% of the population is under the age of 30. And so clearly in line with the youth bulge of the country, the driving ban had to go. At the same time, it reflects Mohammed bin Salman's desire and wish to consolidate all power in his country and to make it clear to civil society, to the public, that the lifting of the driving ban is not because of their activism, which has been going on for decades, but because he decided it. And jailing the women activists is a very clear signal to the Saudi public not to get any ideas, not to think that just because he lifted this driving ban that it had anything to do with what the Saudi public is demanding, and that he will severely punish the Saudi public who makes any demands on him. So in a sense, he is signaling that he will act with absolute authority as an absolute monarch.
Well, let's go to another clip from the censored episode of Hassan Minhaj's show, Patriot Act, on Silicon Valley's relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Since 2016, MBS has invested almost $11 billion in Silicon Valley, making Saudi Arabia the largest single funding source for U.S. startups. Come on, Silicon Valley, you're supposed to be hippie capitalists. WeWork won't let you expense meat, but you take money from Saudi Arabia? So you're against slaughterhouses unless they're in Yemen?
Hassan Minhaj. Courtney Raj, can you respond to that? You were talking about this earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really critical point that might be lost among the broader debate about this, one incident because it is so stark after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But the fact is that we are seeing that tech companies have this very complicated relationship with Saudi Arabia. And in the case of Netflix, it's not clear, how much revenue they receive from Saudi Arabia. What is that financial relationship? They have not responded on the record to those questions. But we know that there are tech companies that have assets, personnel, et cetera, in very repressive countries, which can lead them to comply with, what they might say is a valid local law. But as Sarah noted, it's not valid according to international standards. And we're seeing that this is becoming very complicated because in countries like Saudi Arabia, that's highly censored, or Vietnam, or Myanmar, where there are other mass atrocities happening with the Rohingya, for example, that these platforms such as Facebook, Google's, YouTube, Twitter are complying with government requests to take down content. Oftentimes that should be protected under international law. Now, at least in the case of the companies that I mentioned and at least 70 other countries, according to Access Now, There are transparency reports so that we can see how many government requests for content removal, for takedowns are there, how many do they comply with, how are they received, are they a legal, valid legal order, or are they just coming through secondary communication channels. And I think that's very important. And I think Netflix needs to consider its role as a platform in which journalistic content, there are many documentaries, news shows like Patriot Act that are serving a newsworthy purpose. And they need to consider doing human rights assessments, producing a transparency report, and starting to track government takedown requests, because it's not clear that they're even doing that to begin with. And I think that, you know, they need to understand their responsibility as a platform in this era.
So, Courtney, interestingly, your organization, Committee to Protect Journalists, was just honored on New Year's Eve. As the ball was dropped, journalists were there in Times Square to welcome 2019, because journalists are under so much attack. How significant is this, the message that Netflix is sending to journalists, to actors, to artists around the world when they pull an episode like this that's critical of a dictatorship?
I think Netflix is sending the absolute wrong signal, which is that we're going to comply with your invalid law, with your law that contravenes international rights, that is, you know, a vague, hard to define law. And it's sending a signal, you know, just weeks after Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, that it is going to comply with censorial requests from Saudi Arabia, which has carried out this, you know, unprecedented murder, and which has, you know, as we've heard, continued this war in Yemen. I think that Netflix's decision to comply with this, and the fact that they did not, you know, come out and report on this themselves. It took a journalist from the Financial Times digging to find out that this had happened and to make it aware. I think that this controversy has highlighted for them the fact that they need to get out ahead of these issues. They need to figure out where do they stand on press freedom, on artistic freedom, on freedom of expression. What are their company principles? What does it mean when they're